Today let's talk about a wobble, why it happens and how can we prevent it. Wobble or speed wobble or tank slapper is a shit brick making event when the handlebars suddenly start shaking like crazy and your bike becomes a rodeo bull trying to throw you off onto the ground. Scary stuff. Luckily, your favorite motorcycle instructor to the rescue. Let's learn how to avoid the wobbles. Speed wobble is a complex phenomenon, which is not unique to motorcycles. A lot of vehicles can experience it. Cars, trucks, aircrafts and even bicycles, almost anything with a steerable wheel, can have a speed wobble. It's just with bikes it is more often to end up in a crash. Bad news is that a lot of stuff can be involved in the wobble. Steering geometry, wheelbase, wheels and tires, pavement, suspension settings, load distribution, speed, wind resistance and probably a couple of dozen other things in combination, under certain circumstances, can make a tank slapper possible. Good news, on the other hand, is that most bike manufacturers, at least those who have R&D, not just marketing department, Davidson, excuse me, design their bikes in such a way that under normal conditions, tank slapper is extremely unlikely. Normally, the front wheel on any bike always tends to correct itself and compensate for any road imperfections, which keeps our bike stable and upright. However, though almost any modern bike is designed in such a way that it should not have any wobbling problem, in reality we still can cause a tank slapper. There are two major groups of wobble causes. The first bunch is mechanical in nature, when something is not working the way it should. And the second large group is rider mistakes. And of course, very often wobble can be caused by a combination of several factors. Let's look at most common mechanical reasons first. Pretty common case, which often can contribute in a wobble, is incorrect suspension sag. When you sit down on a motorcycle, you can notice that its suspension sags a little under your weight. Motorcycles are designed to be ridden with a specific amount of sag in mind. The problem is that different people can have different weight. Somebody weighs 60 kilos, somebody 120 kilos. Usually motorcycles from factory are set up for some average rider, and every manufacturer has its own definition of average. For example, I weighed 80 kilos and on KTM Duke I had to set the suspension preload on maximum to have a correct sag setting. And on a Road King with air shocks I had literally zero sag, so I suppose Harley Davidson think their riders only start from 100 kilos. So when the actual rider weighs significantly more or significantly less than theoretical average rider, the suspension sag becomes incorrect and we end up with the wrong geometry, which can easily lead to a whole bunch of handling problems, including the tank slapper. So in this case, we have to set up the sag correctly, with preload adjustment. Similar problem can occur when we start to load the motorcycle. A lot of people, when they load their bike for a trip, don't really account for how their load changes the weight distribution. If, let's say, we take a passenger and a luggage, they significantly increase the load on rear suspension, which obviously sags under the added weight. Now, the geometry of a bike is all jacked up, which can easily cause a wobble on certain speed. The solution, in this case, is pretty simple. Don't overload the bike and adjust the preload on the rear suspension to have a correct sag, required by your manual. Also important thing to consider when you're loading your bike is additional wind resistance. If you have a lot of extra stuff on the back, on higher speeds it starts to act like a sail, unloading your front suspension and again jacking up the steering geometry, which in turn can result in a speed wobble. In this case, you either have to load your bike in a way to minimize the extra wind resistance, or you simply can ride slower to have less wind drag. A lot of times, a failure which causes a wobble is bad suspension condition. Motorcycle suspension, just like other parts, wears out. Suspension fluid degrades over time and springs can sag. Besides that, oil seals can fail and after some time fluid level can drop. of course, all this stuff also can affect our bike's handling in a bad way, possible speed wobbles included. That's why we have to maintain our suspension in a good shape, watch out for oil leaks, watch the chrome plating condition and change the fluid like the manual requires. Also, though it is not very common for motorcycle manufacturers, sometimes we can see the bikes which are just designed not very well. Suspension characteristics can be wrong, or maybe the frame or swing arm can flex a bit too much. There is no easy cure for that, but fortunately, crappy design is very uncommon these days. Wheels and tires play a critical role in handling. As we remember, the front wheel is designed to always make small self-steering movements to stabilize the bike. So obviously, if we have problems with wheels or tires, they can easily lead to problems with steering and wobbling too. Very common thing is underinflated tires. You wouldn't believe how often people don't pay enough attention to tire pressure. For example, back in Moscow, when I was teaching my advanced rider course, probably about half of my students used to come in with underinflated tires. And that's advanced course, so those people supposedly should already know about such stuff. Underinflated tire not only wears out much faster, it also has much bigger contact patch and more flex, which again affects the handling of the bike. Ideally, tire pressure needs to be checked before each ride, certainly not like once a month. Another problem with tires which has big impact on handling is uneven wear, especially on a front wheel. If, for example, the front tire becomes too worn in the middle section, now it can't properly make that self-correcting which we talked about earlier. That's why waiting for the cord to show up is usually not a great idea. Also, the similar problem can occur if we ride on a road with longitudinal grooves, like when they make road repairs, or on metal grid, like on some bridges. Those pavements or worn-out tires usually don't start wobbles themselves, but in combination with some rider mistakes, they certainly can become a problem. The same applies to wheels conditions as well. If you have loose spokes, or your wheels are slightly bent, or if they are very unbalanced, or maybe the rear wheel is badly aligned with the front, it may not directly lead to a wobble, but in combination with some mistakes, it can definitely result in wobbling. And last major mechanical cause for wobbling is worn-out bearings, especially the steering head bearing. If it is worn out too much, again, our front wheel can no longer properly steer itself and stabilize the bike, which can end up in all sorts of handling problems. So, don't forget to check your steering head bearing from time to time. Your handlebars should turn smoothly and freely. Wheel bearings, when they are completely shot, also can pose a serious problem. And chassis bearings, like swing arm and progression bearings, when they seize, severely reduce your rear suspension effectiveness, so bearings should be inspected too from time to time. And now let's move on to another group of speed wobble reasons – riders' mistakes. The most common reason by far, which in combination with some minor mechanical issues can lead to a speed wobble, is a grip on handlebars. Again, remember that by design, the front wheel of your bike is intended to constantly make small corrections to keep your bike in balance. If we just clamp to the handlebars with all our force, we restrict this self-correcting, which makes the handling much worse. Now, when for some mechanical reason, like because of bad suspension or maybe bad bearings or something else of that nature, the handlebar starts to wobble a little, if we start to panic and grip the handlebars with all our force, it usually makes matters much worse. Now, instead of small, easily escapable wobbling, we have a full-on tank slapper. There are a lot of mechanical reasons for small front-end wobbling, but when we add the grip to the mix, the situation becomes 100 times worse. Another rider mistake which can lead to a speed wobble is an erratic throttle behavior. Each time we open or close the throttle, the weight of our bike shifts to the rear or to the front wheel. If at some moment we open the throttle a lot and our bike starts to accelerate pretty fast, we have our front end unloaded. Remember that the front wheel constantly steers itself, so it is almost never dead straight, right? If then at some point we chop the throttle, suddenly the front wheel becomes much more loaded and starts to produce more grip. And the moment before it was unloaded, it was not perfectly straight because it almost never is. So it suddenly starts to overcorrect itself with more force and amplitude than it should. Usually it just ends up in a small brief wobble, no big deal. But in combination with previous mistake, the grip. If the rider panics, this small wobble can easily become a tank slapper. Throttle control is really one of the main skills for any rider. We should always pay it enough attention. Jerking the throttle is pretty dumb practice. And another mistake which can easily cause a tank slapper is a wheelie gone wrong. It's just like in previous case, but now it's much worse. When we do a wheelie, obviously there is no load on the front wheel, it's in the air. Then, let's say we gained some speed and now we need to put the nose back on the road. We must do it gradually. If we just slam the front wheel into the ground, it suddenly gains massive traction. And if at the moment when it hits the road it was not straight ever so slightly, this can easily cause the tank slapper. In fact, if we watch any tank slapper compilation, the most severe ones are usually the result of a badly executed wheelie. Wheelies on public roads are usually not the smartest idea, but if you can't bring the nose down gradually, it becomes to look like a suicide attempt. Solution here is pretty straightforward. Leave the wheelies for parking lots. Okay, we are done with the most common speed wobble causes. As you can see, in fact, it is a pretty easy thing to avoid, if you keep your bike well maintained and don't do stupid stuff. But let's discuss what can we do if we suddenly find ourselves in the middle of a speed wobble. How can we escape it? Above all, there are some survival reactions, instincts, which we should not do. First, we should not grip the handlebars tight. As we already discussed, it only makes matters worse. We need to keep our arms as relaxed as it's possible. To keep ourselves on the bike, we can squeeze the tank really hard with our knees. I want to show you some clip now to prove this idea. Look at this massive tank slapper. The rider gets thrown out of the saddle, but then, once he let go the handlebars, his bike just stays vertical and goes ahead. And second thing is we should not grab the front brake or clutch lever. Yes, in panic we naturally want just to grab anything we can, but in this case it will not help. Here is what we need to do instead. Bikes are designed in such a way that they tend to be upright most of the time. A speed wobble is a pretty rare state, which requires a lot of parameters to be working together. It's like a resonance in a way. It can only happen on certain frequencies. So when we change them, the resonance disappears. The same goes with a speed wobble. Once you change some parameters, you get rid of a speed wobble. What can we do to change this parameter? First, we can change the weight distribution. If we lean forward, we shift some of the weight on the front wheel, which can be enough to pull our bike out of this resonance state. Second option is to change speed. Gradually accelerate or decelerate, though decelerating obviously is a safer option. If we end up crashing, it's better to do it on slower speed. The only thing is that we need to decelerate gradually. Don't just grab the brakes or do something like that. Gradually release the throttle and very gently apply the rear brake. This should be enough to reduce the speed and eventually the wobble should disappear. Gradual deceleration is the safest option here. And now the couple of other methods which I heard of, but I don't think they are pretty good. First is to change lean angle, like gradually apply countersteering. In theory it might work, but the problem here is that your handlebars are already doing this, so it's pretty difficult to apply countersteering gradually. In my opinion, gradually slowing down is a much safer option. And another method, which I heard of, is to try to wheelie your bike out of a wobble. The problem here is that wobble usually happens on higher speeds, on which it is not so easy to wheelie your bike. And besides, again, your bike is doing this. if in this situation you can manage to wheelie your bike, especially from a high speed, you are probably winning some competitions right now instead of watching this video. Okay, here you can watch more about motorcycle steering. I think that's enough for today. As usual, please like, share and subscribe and ask your questions in the comment section. Thank you for watching and have a nice day. Bye!